Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
This is episode 12 in our series on the art of game design by Jesse Schell.
Hey, John.
Hey, Matt.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I had a very busy week at work, but I'm glad it's the weekend and I can relax a little bit. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I feel like, and I know we've talked about this before, but software engineering, I feel like, is different than other professions in that there's always an infinite amount of work, and like you can never do it all.
Yes. Yeah, if you look at a code base long enough, you'll find it's kind of like when policemen pull you over. Like they can always find a reason to pull you over. Like you can always find bugs and things to fix in any code base.
So I have been feeling the infinity acutely this week. But yeah. So would you say you were building interfaces at your job this week?
I am now a backend engineer, which means I can forget about the word interface entirely and just focus on APIs and things like SLOs and stuff like that.
What does I stand for?
Oh, you got me there. Okay, application programming interface. But I feel like that's a slightly different version of interface. And maybe we can talk about kind of the philosophical definition of an interface.
Oh, I want to get into the philosophical definition of an interface.
So my presumption, let me just throw this out and you can prove me wrong, but my presumption is that Jesse Schell is talking about graphical user interfaces, GUIs, for either games or applications or things like that. But I understand his definition is broader. He's kind of talking about how the human interacts with your game or whatever your designed thing is.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point because it's like graphical user interface, right? Like,
yeah.
I think...
Which I guess also includes the controller, like if you're on a PS5 or something.
Yeah? Oh, yeah. Well, right. And so like we were talking about graphical user interfaces. He's talking about user interfaces.
Yeah.
Or more like player interfaces. But we're kind of talking about programming interfaces,
Yes.
And so maybe those are like, those cut along a different dimension. So anyway.
But similar, there are similar concerns, intuitiveness. It's a big thing that API designers struggle with is just designing an API which literally any person and their grandmother can understand and use easily. That's a very hard problem.
Well, this also raises an interesting question. Could you design a game where the player is working with a programming interface? Like, you would have it both be the player's interface and it would be like a programming interface are the things that... So you would maybe have like let's even think that this is a board game, right? And you have some sort of physical representation of like a request.
Oh my God.
And then like, if you didn't shape the request correctly.
This sounds like a Zachtronics game, which are
Yes.
like, these are my crack. I can just play these games infinitely.
Well, let's stop messing around and let's get down to what he really means here though. What did you think about his telling of or breakdown of what user interfaces are?
I guess so. I don't even understand. If he did define what a user interface is, I don't even remember his definition, to be honest. But it's, to me, it is basically any way that the human being is interacting with your thing, which is obviously a huge, huge definition. I think we primarily think of it in terms of video games where, the human being is interacting with the video game through a controller and through some kind of like heads up display. And I also think an important distinction is that the interface it's meta to the game itself. Like it's usually something that's kind of not in the game world. It's like on your screen. But it's kind of like, it's kind of outside of the game world in a lot of cases.
Well, right. And this is kind of what he starts to get into is there's kind of these mappings between the the virtual interface he describes, where like this is the this is kind of the HUD, I think, where some things on the HUD, like maybe you have a button to throw a bomb, or something like on the HUD. It's not like it's not part of the world,
Right.
but it's still something that the user interacts with that affects the world. So, so there's actually kind of a more complicated series of interactions than you might initially think.
Yes. Yeah, and this is actually something, I mean, he talks a lot about game interfaces in this chapter, and I feel like you're kind of touching on it, where game interfaces are fascinating because while they're, like, I think with interfaces, there's always a challenge of attempting to make it as intuitive as possible, because one of the biggest issues you can have with interfaces is people just can't figure out how to use it, and then they just get frustrated and they hate your product. Mm-hmm. So in a video game, you're trying to make things intuitive, but you're also trying to make an interface that's like part of the game. It kind of fits within the look and feel of the game, fits within the aesthetic of the game. And so there's this, I find this to be this super interesting fine line that you're trying to walk, where you're building an interface that's specific to your game and your game's concepts, but also, non-specific enough, kind of using industry idioms where possible to make it so that people can just immediately intuit how to use it. And I've always found that to be super interesting, because I juxtapose it with professional applications, which I think are what we primarily work on, where the user is almost always like a professional, or there's someone working on something and they're trying to achieve some goal.
Right.
And you're trying to make the interface as transparent as possible.
Exactly.
Like there's no goal of like, oh, I want my interface to like aesthetically work within my thing. I mean, that is a goal, like obviously of color schemes and things like that, but you're just trying to make the interface as easy to use as possible. Whereas in a game, you might actually make the interface not necessarily easy to use, but as long as it fits in the game, but is fun for the gamer, it works. And I can think of like, maybe Angry Birds or something, where part of the game is launching these birds, and there's kind of this interface where you pull back on the bird and it has the strength of a launch, and it's an element that you need to figure out, but it's intuitive and it's fun to figure out, and it's kind of part of the game.
Would you say that the delta between the most easy to use version of an interface and a game's interface is the juice? Is that where the juice lives?
Yeah, I think a ton of juice has to live in your interface, but I think there's also games, like I think Dark Souls is a great example of a game where there's a lot of themes in Dark Souls, like austerity and kind of isolation and like, fear to a certain extent. And I feel like those ideals or those kind of concepts are brought into their interface where the interface, I've heard a lot of people refer to the Dark Souls interface as like being janky and kind of like not working super well. But at the same time, it fits really well within the game itself. And
right.
So I think that's an example of an interface that's not necessarily intuitive. And I think it might have been intentional. The designers might have said like, hey, let's make this interface like super minimal and super austere so that it fits within the overall game and experience.
For the folks at home who had Dark Souls would be mentioned before 10 minutes into the podcast, you won this week's round of Dark Souls bingo.
I know, I'm the worst. I talk about the same 3 things every single episode.
I mean, it's a great game, so I think it makes sense for us to reference it. But
I think it's also one of the reasons I think Dark Souls keeps coming up is that it is so different from all other games, but it's also a canonical work in terms of like game design. So it's kind of like
when you say canonical, that usage seems strange to me. I guess, because I guess I think of canonical as being like officially like
I think
saying,
I think I
yeah,
use
sorry.
the term canonical, perhaps incorrectly, but like it is, it's the game which,
Or is it like like a platonic ideal of a game, maybe, or like
like for example, Metroid is the canonical Metroidvania. Like I think Dark Souls is the canonical like Soulsian game.
okay,
That's
okay,
what I mean by that. Where
that's fair.
it exhibits itself like the most of any other game. And it is a genre. It was so different and so unique and so innovative that it now is a genre.
Right, right,
And
right,
so
right.
that to me, that's why I keep bringing it up. I also love the game, so I'm sure there's that reason.
Would you consider the fact that it's janky? And actually, we should probably take a step back. We talked about juice. Let's just kind of define what juice means. He kind of says that juiciness is anything that makes your game kind of delightful to play. And maybe it looks a little silly, but it's like you push on a button and it kind of like bounces and wiggles. Like, was that necessary? Did that make it easier to use? Of course not. But like,
Yeah.
it made it, it gave it this levity. Well, at least that's kind of how I think about juice. But
Yeah.
my question was, I think through a particular lens, the fact that Dark Souls menu system is weird and janky, like, is that juice of the flavor that, Dark Souls is? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I like the way you're putting that, because yeah, I think they're kind of using a vocabulary that they establish in the game itself. They're using that same vocabulary in their interface.
Yeah. Yeah.
This kind of like minimal, not really telling you the full story, kind of being vague, kind of being opaque, and I find that to be super interesting. Like I made the comparison in my notes. I think what we do in writing professional apps, I would compare to like textbooks, where you're not trying to do these super original things. You're kind of trying to crib from everyone else, but like you're trying to increase the informational bandwidth and the usability bandwidth. Whereas video games are more like literature, where a lot of times you're not using the same rules as everyone else. You're breaking a lot of the rules. Like Cormac McCarthy, never using quotation marks for when characters are speaking. There's a reason he does that. It's more kind of, sometimes that blurring that line between the prose and a character speaking can be like an effective way to portray an emotion or portray certain things. So like I would make that same comparison with professional app interface design and video game interface design, where in video games, a lot of times you do break the rules at a loss of some usability, but you're overall improving the work because you're kind of, you're accentuating certain aspects of the video game, even in your interface.
Right. And I think that really dovetails with what he said earlier on about theme, where it's like, pick a theme and every single element should be reinforcing that theme, and I think that applies to the interface as well.
Yeah. He talks about the lens of the physical interface, which I thought was interesting. He says, is there a way to include a physical output device that will make the world become more real? And I thought this was interesting because he follows that thought up with this concept of industry fatigue, where like I think the industry often makes these innovations and then they just lean really hard into that innovation for like 10 years. Like, for example, maybe, well, I don't know if the joystick is a good example, but like I feel like Nintendo came out with the Nintendo 64 controller, which had that like joystick in the middle. And now all controllers since then have had these joysticks, and some of them have two. And it's kind of like everyone's sort of afraid to innovate on the like controller concept. But then Nintendo comes along and introduces these like motion controls, which are just this crazy, like different way of doing things. And I feel like Nintendo has just always been, they've always had the A game in terms of like trying crazy new things, crazy new ways of controlling things, crazy new ways of like form factors. Like, you know, the Switch could transition gracefully from being a handheld thing to like being a TV thing. Like, I've always been impressed with Nintendo to kind of avoid that style of industry fatigue.
Right. Well, it's like, it's just brilliant because, I mean, this has been, even since the Game Boy, they're like, our value prop is not going to be the raw power of the hardware.
Yeah.
You know, it's going to be the packaging. We're going to think about a clever and different packaging that is going to enhance the gameplay over and above there. It can push more pixels to the screen.
Yeah.
And I think, good on them.
Good on them for sure. Like Nintendo has always been about just the basics of what makes a game a good game. You know, the kind of meat and potatoes of game development. Whereas a lot of other people focus on like the sugar, like, hey, we have the best hardware. Like I remember the PS4 being advertised as having like a 9-core processor or something. Mm-hmm. And it's like, who cares? Are you making good games? Like, I don't care about how many processors you have. Just make good games.
Yeah.
And, I think the PlayStation has amazing games. Don't get me wrong, but I just think Nintendo has always had like a laser focus on that, which I am impressed with.
So I have a couple of questions about VR. Do you think Nintendo is going to try to do VR?
It's a great question because I think another thing Nintendo is really, really good at is understanding when a technology is viable. And I am a huge fan of VR and a proponent of it. And I've even worked professionally in VR, but I still think it has a ways to go before it's truly ready for the mass consumption on the level that Nintendo would be interested in.
Yeah.
So, I think the moment it is ready, I think Nintendo might jump on it, but I feel like in that type of space, like the form factor space, they're not like technologically innovative. They are very innovative in terms of the form factor they use, but it's generally like technologies that have been around the block a few times. Like even with the motion controls, like that technology had been around for a while. It was kind of a somewhat proven technology. And I feel like they jump on those technologies like when they're ready. So.
Right. Like they can kind of take these now commodity components and then combine them to make this really novel experience.
That's my perception of how they operate anyway. I mean, I'm not an employee at Nintendo, so I'm probably missing out on some information, but that's my perception.
I didn't even think about this when I asked the question, but this would be Nintendo's second foray into VR. They had the Virtual Boy.
Yeah.
So
the red, everything like in those red straight lines.
So they may be a little skittish because I think has been one of their more fantastic failures.
Yes.
I think.
Dude, did you ever play the Virtual Boy?
I have never played the Virtual Boy. Have you?
I did play the Virtual Boy. My best friend growing up, who was my next door neighbor, he rented a Virtual Boy at one point. This was back when you could like rent entire systems. And we played it and it was actually pretty fun. Like I can't remember what the game was called or whatever, but it was like you're cruising around in like a spaceship or something. And it was like, this is cool. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. I think if it was completely devoid of value, like Nintendo wouldn't have put it out. But I think that the problem was, I think it was hard to play. There were just like negative effects of playing it for any meaningful period of time.
Yeah, you're just destroying your vision or something.
Your visual system, yeah. And then I guess my next question is more about how VR, like what does VR change about this book? Because this book is actually like at least 10 years old, I think. And so I don't think he really talks about VR interfaces at all. And I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about that.
Definitely. Yeah, that was one area of what we were building. And we were building more of a, we were building a 3D modeling app, which you and I have personally discussed this a lot, like whether it's a good idea to build a 3D modeling app in VR. But that debate aside, which we are both massive fans of Blender, by the way, for the fan base. And, if I had personally been in charge of the project, I may not have chosen to build a 3D modeling software. But in any case, we struggled a lot with what the interface should look like. Because in VR, you can't just have some interface that's like locked to the user's vision. Like that's strange. You kind of want your interface to be in world, but you also want, aspects of what an interface can do, like use metaphors and have like sliders and buttons and, selectable objects and things like that. So yeah, it's a very, I think interface design in VR is like a new science that is a frontier. There's a lot of people have great ideas. A lot of people are trying different things, and it's very interesting. And it'll be interesting to see where it winds up. Did you see his illustration for the lens of transparency?
I loved that so much.
Stupid.
This is interesting because I was reading this on my phone.
Yeah.
So just to describe what the illustration looks like, it's just a gray square. So I didn't know. I was like, oh, that's weird. Like, did this not load? This image not load or something? So I couldn't tell if it was just like a bug or something. But I just eventually, I was like, all the other images have loaded. But
yeah. I guess it's easier to tell in book form that it's just a joke. So yeah, his sense of humor, I appreciate it. Another thing he mentioned is just interface elements or even gameplay elements that like kind of serve no purpose. You mentioned this earlier, like juicification. But the example he used, I absolutely love it. The net on a basketball hoop.
Yes.
I love that example because it's so, you never think about it. Like you don't need a net on a basketball hoop. Like the ball goes through the hole, like whatever. But the net just adds so much. Obviously it allows you to see it better. Like I'm sure it was kind of a no-brainer to add a net because seeing a ball go through like a metal hoop is difficult,
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Like I was thinking about that. And I was like, oh yeah, it would be really hard to tell from afar. Did that go in?
But it's also just led to so much like, lore and like terminology about basketball. Like the whole nothing but net thing is like, just this totally baller move and
swoosh.
Yeah. So I just love that example. I thought it was great. And then Juice, I did want to touch on Juice again, just because at this time I was reading this chapter, I was also watching this series of videos, which I should have written down what the name of the series was, but they're by this Japanese game designer. And he talks about different elements of Juice. Like one video I was watching in particular was pausing the game when something is happening. Mm-hmm. Like the example he used was Street Fighter. A lot of times if you do like a really powerful punch in Street Fighter or kick, the game will pause briefly when the kick strikes the other player or whatever. And it's just this like very minimal, just pauses the game. It's not like some kind of crazy effect or anything, but it's this super duper effective form of Juice where it just adds so much, like it just makes the punch feel so much more powerful and crazy. And he gave this kind of brief history of that form of Juice, where he went all the way back to like Atari games. There's this game called Defender, which when you get hit by an enemy like alien ship, the game pauses very briefly before your ship actually explodes.
Oh, that I love. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, I loved that like historical lens of like one type of Juice, because Juice is this other thing. I think it might be the single most important concept in game design, juicification. It's so important to like, you design your mechanics, but then you have to put this layer of kind of juice on top of them, or they'll just be these like sterile, boring mechanics. And it's so interesting to look at that historical lens of how like one form of Juice has developed over time. and it was hyper effective 20 years ago, and it's still hyper effective today. Just thought that was very cool.
I think Celeste might have, if I recall correctly, it used a similar effect where there is a freeze frame, and
Yes.
it makes sense. I mean, it borrows so much from those 2D platformers.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an awesome effect, and it's one of those forms of juice that you don't think about that often. I think usually when people think of juice, they're thinking of like, clicking a button and it wiggles, or, maybe something exploding into confetti, or kind of these more like obvious forms of juice. But there's just so many different things you can do, and they're all useful and all work really well.
I am genetically predisposed not to be able to create juice.
Yeah.
When I'm building an interface, I'm like, all right, the button's there. When you click it, it does the thing. Like, I do not have that innate sense to, we should make it, wiggle when we click on it. So
me
I just
neither.
need to-
Yeah.
It feels like it's not that I don't want to add it, but it's a real chore, because I almost need to, like, okay, let me go through every element of my interface and see if I can add some visual artifact when you interact with it.
Juice is hard because it's you like once you start working on juice, you're coming away from that, like, input A leads to event B, and you're moving into a world of like input A leads to some sort of real-time thing happening that then calls back into event B. And like adding juice just from an engineering perspective is hard. It's a hard problem. So I think that's part of the reason, like, I also always avoid it. I never think of it, because you just want to keep things simple, and juice almost by definition is like additional complexity.
And to your point, it's complexity in a dimension that, like, you need to add whole additional systems essentially to support that have no other purpose than to just do the juice. So you're like, oh my gosh, like, now I need this whole like animation system on my buttons,
Exactly.
So.
But it's so important. And I'm glad you're talking about, pressing buttons and having juice and like things happen after you press the button, because there's another rule that's almost like the enemy of juice, which is the 10th of a second rule that he talked about. And this I wanted to call out because I've experienced this. Like, I've tried to make games in the past, and we've made a couple games, and there's always this kind of war between, like, you want to add juice and you want your juice to be as juicy as possible, but then you don't want any user input to take more than a 10th of a second to like show the outcome of the input.
Right.
So say you had a button and it wiggled for longer than a 10th of a second after the user pushed it, that would almost immediately be frustrating to the user.
Yeah.
And I've definitely seen this in practice in my own work, where I get a little overzealous and make the juice last too long. It starts to feel annoying. Another element that I've realized about this is it is amazing what you can skip in the interest of getting user input to have immediate feedback. Like, one example that I love that I ran into with my cousin the other weekend, because we work on game projects together, is we were trying to do a door open animation. Mm-hmm. And there was a point where we were just like, hey, can we just like immediately like have the door appear in the open, state? Which from a real life standpoint is obviously ridiculous. But when we tried it in the game, it was like, it actually felt fine. Like, it's just like you click open door and it's just like, boom, the door is like all the way open instantaneously. And it was like weirdly not a big deal. And, I'm not saying that's a good way to design doors, but it's just weird how much of reality you can kind of skip through, and it doesn't feel that weird to the gamer.
Yeah, it is funny. And it feels like someone who maybe, I guess if you didn't test your game enough, like if you have a game with a lot of doors, like, it's just going to be a chore to go through all these doors. You're like, oh my God, I have to watch this freaking door animation. It takes 500 milliseconds, every single time I open this door. Like, no, just swing it open.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I think when animation like that is important is when the user might lose and I'm kind of thinking more in the like, you're just trying to get something done, the professional apps. Like, I think some companies can overdo the animation.
Yeah.
But I do also think there are contexts where animation is actually super important, where there's like multiple objects maybe moving relative to one another, or like the whole view is moving, or like something is expanding.
Yeah.
Animation provides this really important like tie between the two states. So your mind can be like, okay, I know exactly where all of these things went relative to one another.
Right.
So I think sometimes the animation actually makes it kind of easier to understand what happened.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think, I mean, and maybe if we're kind of taking the inverse of that, it's like there's one door. Where could it possibly go? And maybe that's why just like swinging it open immediately, it's like your brain is like, yep, I know what happened, so I'm ready to walk through that door.
Yeah, exactly. It's like your brain's like, oh, they skipped the boring part. Great.
Yeah. One interface tip that they have that struck me as very interesting is sound maps to touch, and I think this does kind of tie back to Juice.
Yeah.
But it's something I've never really thought about. But like when I thought about it more, it's true, right? It's like when you're like anything you're touching, like there's going to be some, or for the vast majority of times, there's some auditory correspondence there.
Yeah. I also think that's a really good way to give that immediate feedback, just from like a practical standpoint. Like if you do have some juice effect that's maybe longer than a tenth of a second, like what you're talking about, like say some user interaction readjusts the whole layout of the screen, you might want to have like a, longer than a tenth of a second animation to do that. But you would still play a sound like immediately when the user click the button so that you can give that like immediate kind of primal feedback.
Yeah. That, that he talked about that primacy, or the lens of primality, I think.
Yeah, the lens of primality, which I love that notion of like, we're humans. We're not that, we like to fancy ourselves as these like amazing, super evolved creatures, but we still have these like ancient instincts, gathering food, providing a house for your loved ones. And if you can tap into that in your game, like that's a good thing.
Yeah, I never thought like I've seen what he talks about where babies or very young children are very engaged with iPads. And I guess I never realized it's like it's basically what you're doing already. It's like you're touching things with you're seeing something.
Yeah.
And you're touching it and you're moving it around and it's like that's why those interfaces are so engaging. It's like, what are all these weird little squares that I need to hit with my fingers? Like, I don't know what that means, like that doesn't mean anything to me. Our evolutionary ancestors didn't have very straight rows of buttons and like to go kill that I don't know, gazelle or whatever. So
yeah. No, totally. And I do think that the more primality you have, the more you kind of tap into that like innate, just instantly understood, almost in an instinctual way, type of game that could be played by a baby or a cat. You've seen cats play those games where they have to like smash bugs or whatever.
Yeah. 100%.
It's because those games are hyper primal. So I really like that lens.
Yeah. So I think that's the takeaway. If you need to determine if your game is primal, show it to a cat.
Yeah, and post it on TikTok because I want to see that.
I'm going to blast that everywhere. It's going to be all over. Instagram, Be Real, the new hotness. No, you can't post videos on Be Real. Anyway, now I really don't have anything else. Did you?
I have pretty much exhausted my notes. I did want to ask you if you had ever read Design of Everyday Things, because I've heard that book be brought up so many times and I've never read it. It's been on my list. And I was just curious if you had ever read it.
Should that be our next switch statement book?
Maybe. I've heard that it's like kind of a seminal work in that space. And I guess Design of Everyday Things is more of a, I mean, I've never read it, so I can't give like a great synopsis, but I think it's more of a real world, you know, like, oh, how do you design like a push door? You know, those doors that have that like push bar on them, you know, like, why is that a push bar? I'm sure there's some great history about like crowds smashing each other or something that you know.
Right. I mean, every time I use an in-swing door that is supposed to lead outside, I'm like, that's going to be bad for crowd crush.
Exactly.
6-unit apartment building.
Yeah. So I think the book covers topics like that, where it's like, hey, here's a real world object. Why is it like this? And I find that fascinating.
I mean, I think we should have an expansive catalog here. So, well, let's say it'll be one of the contenders for the next book. So,
sounds good. But yeah, that completely exhausts my notes. I thought this was a fun chapter. A lot of really thought-provoking things.
Yeah, a little video game heavy, I feel like, but you know, I think. Yeah, I feel like this book, it needs to kind of like strike a delicate balance, you know, between the two. And I think it's okay that this one was a little video game heavy as opposed to like a board game or something. So.
Right. Yeah. No, he's got to cover. Yeah, it's an ambitious work. I mean, he's covering the entirety of game design.
All games. Yeah, so for next week, we actually have kind of a big one. In the spirit of wrapping the art of game design up, it sounds like we're gonna be looking into story and worlds. It's gonna be over the course of 6 chapters. So
wow, a lot of reading.
Expansive, yeah. We're covering all of storytelling next week.
Yeah, it'll be really fun stuff.
All right, fantastic. See you then.
See you, Matt.